Well, good morning in the age of coronavirus. I'm feeling kind of nostalgic for the 60s these days, and as you can see from my budding afro, I'm kind of halfway there. But seriously, the 60s loom large in my mind this week because 78 days ago this week, two fellows were born that became, literally icons of the 60s music era. One was Paul McCartney of the Beatles, and 2 days later, Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys. Now, back in the day, the Beatles and the Beach Boys were quite literally each other's biggest fans. The Beatles very much admired what the Beach Boys had done in the studio, especially with their album Pet Sounds. And the Beach Boys, of course, were in awe of the Beatles, live performances, energy, and of course their songwriting skills. So the interesting thing about both Paul McCartney and Brian Wilson, two very creative individuals. Brian Wilson was dubbed a genius in the day. I don't know that anybody called Paul McCartney a genius, although no one could really argue with his massive talents. But what's interesting about these two, born only 2 days apart, of course, they have similar charts, but they have similar unique charts as well because they're both born with the Kala Sarpa yoga. So here I have on the chart, on the screen, the chart of Paul McCartney. So, for those of you who are not quick to recognize this, have a look at Rahu and Ketu. This becomes the defining axis for a Kala Sarpa chart. And you can quickly see here in McCartney's chart that all of the planets lie on one side of the Rahu Ketu axis, quite literally and quite cleanly. Now, McCartney has what we call a type 2 Kala Sarpa configuration. It's not perfect. Between Rahu and Ketu, there are 5 intervening signs. In the perfect type, Pisces would be filled out as well. It's not, and so this is slightly imperfect, but still very powerful. So this is a type 2 Kala Sarpa. Now, in the Kala Sarpa configuration, the first things we look at are the influences upon the nodes. And we can review those in 2 different ways. The dispositors of the nodes become important, and also any planet that associates with or aspects a node becomes important. And those very planets, come to the foreground in terms of exerting an effect on the chart. So let's have a quick look at this in Paul McCartney's chart. So notice Rahu in Leo in the 12th house. Now, wherever Rahu is, it reflects something of a compulsion, as opposed to Ketu, which reflects something of a neglect in the individual. Rahu in the 12th, can create a very strong sex drive because, the 12th house is pleasures of the bed. The 12th house is associated with many other things, including international travel, and it's well known that the Beatles became an international phenomenon. But let's zero in. Rahu's dispositor is the sun. The sun is located in Gemini in the 10th house. So in the 10th house, the sun gets Digbala. So this gives the person organizational skills, a sort of a command and control disposition. And Paul McCartney was really the organizer and manager of the Beatles in many ways. So there's that. Sun is strong and it's stabilized by Jupiter, its friend, and there's no influence with any malefics. Okay, so that takes care of Rahu. No planet associates with nor aspects Rahu. So we're finished with that. It's only the dispositor. When we move to Ketu, we see, well, it's at Aquarius, so its dispositor is Saturn. And then there may be influences upon it. There's no planet with it, of course, but does any planet aspect it? Well, a quick glance will tell you that Mars aspects from the 11th onto Ketu. Jupiter aspects from the 10th onto Ketu, and Saturn from the 9th aspects onto Ketu. Now, among those 3, Saturn is the most important because Saturn is both the dispositor and it aspects Ketu. So let's have a closer look at Saturn. So Saturn is in the ninth house. That's good. So both nodal dispositors are in positive houses, Kendra and Trachona, respectively. Saturn is in a friendly sign with a friendly planet Mercury. And notice that Mercury is the lord of the first and the 10th house, self and career. Mercury is retrograde, therefore bright. We consider it powerful. Mercury and Saturn now form yoga. Because Mercury is a double Kendra lord, it can combine with Saturn, a trinal lord of the fifth, to form what we refer to as two Dharma Karma Adipati yogas, Raja yogas. So signatures of power located in the ninth house bodes well for publishing. Both Lennon and McCartney made millions, quite literally, from their songwriting publishing. And of course, the sales of records, which is another form of publishing, I guess. So all very powerful. So far, so good. Now, in any Kala Sarpa, it has the power to kind of magnify whatever is out of the ordinary in that horoscope. So what constitutes something out of the ordinary? Well, a planet that is exalted, debilitated, combust, or retrograde. So in Paul McCartney's case, we have a few instances. So for instance, I neglected to mention, out of the ordinary is the moon when it is very dark or when it is very bright. So new or full. So the moon in this case is dark because it's just a couple days after the new moon. Mars is debilitated. Mercury is retrograde, and Jupiter is combust. Okay, Jupiter is widely combust, so we're not too concerned about that. Mercury is retrograde. This is actually a positive, and already discussed, given its yogas with Saturn. The moon is mixed, so what we refer to as both positive and negative. Positive because it's in its own sign, Cancer. Negative because it is dark. But the moon occupies the 11th house of income, of group endeavors and enterprises, and so basically it holds its own there, and that's all well and good. Moon and Mars, of course, form Chandramangala Yoga, which is one of the basic wealth yogas because it implies energy and initiative and will get things done. Mars is a bit of a problem because it is debilitated, but Mars also enjoys Neecha Bhanga. Now, Neecha Bhanga does not mean cancellation. It means more modification or amelioration or mitigation, some relief to a troublesome situation. So look at Mars. It can be relieved in a number of ways. One, by its own dispositor. So if its dispositor associates with or aspects it or occupies an angle, it can be relieved. So in this case, Moon is in the same sign as Mars. It's relieved by that. Mars is debilitated in Cancer, and we ask ourselves what planet would be exalted in Cancer? And the answer to that is Jupiter. Jupiter does not make contact with that Mars, but it does occupy an angle. So there we have some another source of Neecha Bhanga, some relief. Then the third element is Mars is debilitated in Cancer. Where would it be exalted? It would be exalted in Capricorn. The Lord of Capricorn is Saturn. And now we ask ourselves, does Saturn make contact with Mars or occupy an angle? Well, we see it's in the ninth house, so it doesn't occupy an angle, but Saturn does aspect Mars. So there's relief there. So there's three-way relief for this Mars. And therefore, some of its more positive qualities will come forward and less of its negative qualities will come forward. All in all, this makes for a very powerful Kala Sarpa yoga. Partly because it's almost perfect, a type 2, something that occurs in only 2% of the population. Okay, for comparison and contrast, let's have a look at Brian Wilson's chart. So he's born just 2 days later, just under 48 hours. Of course, the Earth has rotated a couple of times. different ascendant has come into place, and the moon has moved on from Cancer to Leo. So here's the moon in his chart, and here it occupies the fourth house. On the Rahu Ketu axis. Okay, so again, we look first and foremost at where Rahu and Ketu. Rahu is in the fourth house, where we expect to see some sort of compulsion, as opposed to Ketu in the 10th house in some area of neglect. Well, Rahu in the fourth creates a bit of a domesticity, an insularity, an introversion, a nesting instinct. One of the songs that Brian Wilson wrote, the words were, "There's a place where I can go and tell my troubles to, in my room, in my room." So there's Rahu, in his room, the fourth place of, the personal space. Of course, the moon is there as well, too, and wherever the moon goes, there goes the mind. So there's that notion of, keeping to oneself a certain degree of insularity, as opposed to Ketu in the 10th house, some degree of neglect. Now, look, he was a performing artist, but it was not the thing that he liked to do. He liked to be in the studio. And, over the years, he had many, mental problems, anxiety attacks, depression, was involved in major therapy for years that cost a fortune, literally. 20 grand a month back in the late 60s and 70s. Very, very expensive therapy. So why does that occur? We'll get to that in just a second. Let's quickly look at the nothing much has changed except for the moon and the rotation of the chart in Brian Wilson's chart compared to Paul McCartney's. But we must look at the dispositors. So Rahu's dispositor, of course, it didn't leave Leo, so its dispositor is still the Sun. Sun and Jupiter are together. They don't form any yoga in the second house, although this is good for, vocal power, family, monetary efforts, and some degree of success, and authorial skills, writing skills. We look at Ketu's dispositor. Of course, it's still Saturn. And of course, Saturn is prime among the influences upon Saturn because it both disposes and aspects. Mars aspects as well, Jupiter aspects as well, but Saturn because it's both dispositor and aspector looms large. Check this out now, Saturn and Mercury in the ascendant, these also form yoga as well too. Note that for a chart with a Venus-ruled ascendant, Saturn becomes Yoga Karaka, meaning it has potential by virtue of owning a trine, the 9th, and a Kendra, the 10th. It has the potential to form yoga. That's just potential. Does it combine with another productive planet? Yeah, it does actually, with Mercury. So Mercury is a trinal lord, and so it can combine with Saturn in its role as Kendra lord. And then with treating Saturn as a trinal lord, it can combine with Mercury, which is a money lord, and it'll form a Dana yoga there. So first it'll form a Raja yoga and then a Dana yoga. So this is a pretty powerful construct as well too. Saturn and Mercury in the first, gives a certain degree of intelligence. Mercury gets Digbala in the first, it's retrograde, it's doubly strong. This creates powerful yogas in the ascendant. So this is all well and good, and again another instance of a powerful Kala Sarpa. This is what we call a type 4. So in this instance, when a planet occupies the same sign as Rahu or Ketu, it is either a type 3 or a type 4. If the moon stays within the limits of the Rahu-Ketu axis, so if the moon was over here at 10 degrees, it would be a type 3. As soon as it crosses that line of 1446 onto literally the other side of the Rahu-Ketu axis without leaving the sign of Leo, this becomes a type 4. Still pretty uncommon, 6.5% of all horoscopes have this configuration. And it still, contains a lot of power because, again, Rahu, the Kala Sarpa configuration allows the magnification or amplification of whatever is weak or strong in the chart. So I've talked about some of the strong things. Let's go to a his mental disorders. So the fourth house is the place of what we call the manas, M-A-N-A-S. A term from Vedic psychology, referring to the unconscious mind. That part of the mind that, registers perceptions, organizes likes and dislikes, and is the foundation for personality. When Rahu or the nodes or Saturn influence the fourth house or its lord, it's problematic. It deranges the mind to some degree. So here we have Rahu in the fourth house. So that's a sign of some, sort of oddity and odd perceptions and subsequent behaviors. The fourth lord is the sun, and neither Saturn nor a node influences it, so that's okay. But the moon is what we call a Karaka for the manas, and it's in the fourth house with Rahu, so that is somewhat deranging as well too. And the two of them contributed to, anxieties, phobias, single instances, or in this case, just a couple of instances of this sort of thing, don't make a person crazy. There's got to be more to it. Saturn in the ascendant, lends to this a little bit, just because Saturn is a loner, can be phobic, can be depressive, etc. And, that alone is not going to make a person, give a person anxieties or depression. It's the combination of all of the above that helps to do that. And again, the Kala Sarpa configuration exaggerates those things that might pass off as, almost normal in an average individual, but they get heightened in someone like him with the Kala Sarpa configuration. So check out this Mars. I could go through it. This Mars actually enjoys Neecha Bhanga several times over, more even than Paul McCartney's, and that's courtesy of Saturn being angular, both literally in this chart and also angular from the moon as well to it. It picks up extra influence and points in amelioration. I don't want to go into that, but to talk about something else. With Mars in the third house, we have a case of a Karako, Bhavo, Nashto, and that's where you have the Karaka for a thing is in the same house of that thing. And unless things are perfect in that regard, there will be trouble with respect to that thing. So what's the thing? Mars is the Karaka for brothers and sisters. The third house is the place of brothers and sisters. So when you have Mars in the third, then it is the signature for some potential problem. And that Mars ought to be in at least neutral, if not good shape. Otherwise, there can be problems. So notwithstanding the Neecha Bhanga that exists, Mars debilitated in the third is not a good prognosis. And then the fact that Saturn aspects it makes it doubly problematic. So this does create some problems for siblings. Now, the Beach Boys were formed with three Wilson brothers, Brian and his two brothers, Dennis and Carl. And although, they were strong enough as brothers to, form a musical group that literally went to the top of the charts and made millions, they also had difficulties as well, too. As their music evolved, and Brian wanted to get into more and more sort of creative work in the studio and doing things that were literally different, while Dennis and Carl just wanted to continue making, surf music. They clashed, and they clashed frequently over the years about the direction of the group. That aside, there were literal problems for the second brother, Dennis, who fell in with Charles Manson for a while and his little harem of women, and so Dennis ended up getting gonorrhea many times over. It played hell with his relationships. He was married and divorced 4 times. He had substance abuse issues. He ultimately died having jumped off a pier in Southern California and went underwater and never came up again and drowned. So some sorrows associated with brothers in this chart. So there you have it. Paul McCartney and Brian Wilson, both, Um, Amazing musicians, both played bass in the performances of their respective bands. Paul McCartney was really quite an amazing musician in on all counts. He could play drums. He knew his way around the keyboard. He was certainly good with guitar. He was a balladeer and acoustic guitar and many famous compositions. And as it turned out, courtesy of some Wikipedia research, he was also quite an amazing lead guitarist and did the lead pieces on a lot of studio productions, something I had not known before. In a way, quite unusual individuals, icons of their time for, the vanguard of the British invasion and, feel-good American surf music. Both considered brilliant contributors to 60s music, and both with the rare configurations of Kala Sarpa, which have this capacity to elevate the individual beyond what their chart would normally suggest. So I'm going to post an equivalent article onto my website, navamsha.com. You can read that, and we'll cover quite a bit more detail than I did today, and you will learn even more about Kala Sarpa. Okay, thanks for tuning in. See you later.